All right, let's keep moving and shift gears a little bit, right, to our next topic that we want to talk about. Over the week, there was an interesting article in a Bitcoin magazine talking about Bitcoin treasury companies. The author at some point questions whether MSTR is a Ponzi scheme. And actually, that's something I've been hearing a little bit more over the last few days. We thought it would be a good idea to briefly go over it and explain why MSTR is not a Ponzi scheme. And maybe here, Quentin, you want to set the scene?
Yeah, sure. So maybe what is the argument in this article of why MSTR or strategy looks like a Ponzi is that the way they plan to raise money to pay the dividends on their preferreds is what the author is looking at, right? Because they issue shares at the market, then they have to pay dividends on those shares. And the way they are supposed to pay the dividends is by issuing new additional shares, which then, if you just look at that, it is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. It's right, because you issue new instruments to pay the investors that were there before. And it all falls apart when you can't find anyone anymore to purchase the new ones. And that is true in that sense, but it doesn't look at the whole structure of the company strategy and the fact that they actually hold, we saw in the slides before, they hold 65 billion worth of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. So it's not like they don't have any way to pay back those dividends. And I don't think strategy ever communicated that they would issue more of the same instrument to pay those dividends. They just have a lot of flexibility to issue whatever is best in the market at that point in time. And we saw, for example, for the Q2 dividends, they had around 50 million worth of dividends to pay. And they just issued the common stock ATM because it was the best thing to do at that time. It took them half a day to raise the 50 million for the full quarter's dividends. So that was the right thing to do at that time. Maybe next quarter it will be something else. They just have a lot of different options. Worst case, they still sit on all of the Bitcoin that they could also use to pay back dividends.
So as we saw, right, they have 65 billion worth of Bitcoin and the dividends paid were at 50 million. So you're talking a small fraction of this, right? So they're good for their money. That's essentially what's happening is they're being backed completely by Bitcoin. And it's a very liquid asset. Obviously, you could argue, if you're not a Bitcoin believer, then yeah, you could argue it is a Ponzi scheme because you believe that Bitcoin is a speculative asset and that probably it won't be outperforming fiat over the long run, right? But that's probably the only view that I would see where calling it a Ponzi scheme makes sense. If you're a Bitcoin believer, then as mentioned, you're backed by Bitcoin. And maybe just to bring an additional point here is obviously their operating model is selling Bitcoin backed securities, right? So they're selling, again, STRF, STRD, STRK, and MSTR backed by Bitcoin. And those are their products. So essentially, their investors are also their customers. I think it's just a unique setup that you need to shift your mind to understand what they're selling really. It happens that their securities are also their products. So it takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around that, I think. And I hope that that clears out a bit of the fog around this hard belief that MSTR is a Ponzi.
And we need to look at the whole scale of it, right? We already showed last week, we can flash it up again, is the current notional value of those preferred shares in the market. So today with those three instruments, they have 3.4 billion worth of shares outstanding. Assuming a 10% dividend, that's 300 million per year of dividends that they need to come up with, right? And again, that's against the 65 billion of Bitcoin that they hold. So it's not leveraged at all in that sense. Of course, if they had 100 billion, it might be different. But then by the time they have 100 billion outstanding, probably their treasury will also be a lot bigger. So it's always also is in relation to their treasuries that you need to look at these things.
And maybe just one last point here is also that it's not much different than a company who has a tremendous amount of leverage and keeps rolling it forward, right, to cover their operations. I would argue, if you're looking at it from a fiat standpoint. All right, maybe just one thing to end up here is obviously this is a bit of a more controversial topic, right? So if there are questions that remain, comments, feel free to add them on our YouTube channel or just ask us on X. We're quite active and we're happy to answer all of these questions in a future episode and maybe deep dive further if there's still some uncertainty or unclarity somewhere there.
How many chairs are you sitting on right now?